we've got, it looks like 12 people on at the moment, and I think we were expecting about double that, 18 or 20 people. So if they trickle in, they will miss the orientation portion. But I just want to thank everybody for, again, joining us this evening for the 2020 Conservation Games. We are not yet a week into the games, and already there is a lot of activity. A lot of people have signed up, and points are being awarded across the board. And I will just give a personal shout out to Team Fields. We had our volunteer event yesterday in a misting weather, and Kevin, who's here, and his daughter Savannah were wonderful volunteers, and we were out at Shalom Farms in Powhatan. And I don't know, we picked a lot of collards. They got shipped off with the truck from Feedmore, so we know that a lot of people ate well last night. And we even picked some green peppers that I think we're going to a mobile market that Shalom operates in what we're accustomed to calling food deserts, but we learned some other terms yesterday too, didn't we, Kevin?
That's right, we did.
Learned about being low food access, and now another term that is getting more popularly used, which is food apartheid.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. Well, thank you all for joining. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and start sharing my screen so that we can get into the presentation. What I would ask, because we have a number of participants, and to try to limit the background noise, is ask you to mute yourself. If you do want to say something during the presentation, by all means, please put it in the chat, and we will try to call on you appropriately. I would also advise everybody that we are going to record this webinar since it's the first time that it will be presented. There's a lot of data in it, and I think for those of you who are familiar with local comprehensive plans, those of you who look at our food security and what we are doing to ensure the long-term success of our region, this will be an interesting report for you. So with that, I will share my screen and thank everybody for joining.
And it looks like, just before you start, Parker, or go ahead and share, but it looks like, is that Tad Thompson who's just joined us? Team Fields co-captain?
Team Fields co-captain. Hey, Tad.
Hey, Parker.
Do you want to say anything before we get into our webinar tonight?
I got back from exercising my First Amendment rights.
Thank you for voting.
With a yard sign.
Well,
so now ready to pay attention. And I'm tickled that I got to post Team Fields on my Facebook page.
Excellent. Well, Tad, we've asked all the participants to mute themselves so that we can go through the presentation, and then we'll open it up for some questions. But this should be a very enlightening review and report for those of you that have not yet seen Farms Under Threat. Again, my name is Parker Agelasto, and I am the Executive Director for the Capital Region Land Conservancy, and I welcome you to this portion of the 2020 Conservation Games, where Team Fields is presenting on the report Farms Under Threat that was issued earlier this year by the American Farmland Trust. Farms Under Threat in this event is grateful for answer, Engel Family Farms, and we are welcomed by Kevin Engel, and we greatly appreciate his support. I will just simply mention that Kevin is a farmer who operates on 25,000 acres. A lot of land, but it is a family enterprise with his 2 sons and his daughter who work with him, along with a number of other employees. And I think Denise, his wife, has a big role in this as well. So thank you, Kevin, and we appreciate everything that you do and continue to do to preserve farmland in our region. As I said, we're going to talk about Farms Under Threat tonight. And this was issued earlier in 2020 by the American Farmland Trust. It went state by state to evaluate not only what has happened in terms of conversion of agricultural lands, but what are the policies that each state has in place to address the loss of agricultural land. And this is a very interesting, and it's the first of its kind report that allows for a comparison to be made between Virginia and North Carolina, between California and New York, and to really dig deep into what are trends that we see and what are some recommendations and best practices that we could tap into from other jurisdictions. I'm going to focus primarily tonight on what has happened in Virginia, with a little bit of comparison in Virginia and other localities, but to really dig deeper into the Virginia data and present on the Richmond region. Much of the data that was in this report and that I will be citing as it relates to the Richmond region locality by locality is taken from the United States Department of Agriculture census of agriculture that is completed every few years. It's kind of like our American Community Survey that does demographic data, but this is demographic data primarily on farmers and farmlands, and it's done county by county. The biggest takeaway that I think we need to understand about this report is that Virginia scored high medium for the conversion threat and policy response because our threat is higher than our response. That means land, agricultural land primarily, is being converted at a faster rate and at a rate that we are ineffective in responding to from policy perspectives. What does that mean for us? That means that we can do better. And this grid really shows how different states compare. And you will see Virginia is in this orange box, right? Close to high on a policy level, but we are also kind of in that high threat to agricultural land. In the top left corner, which is the optimal corner to be in, you can see Oregon and Washington State. In the corner that is less optimal, you will see Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, South Carolina. This is pretty much our rural South where we have historically had substantial farmlands, and they are showing a significant threat and a low response to that threat. Now, what makes Virginia even more critical in this is that when you look at the absolute acres that have been converted, and we're looking at a time period of 2001 to 2016, Virginia has lost 340,000 acres of agriculture out of the 50 states in the absolute loss of acreage of farmlands to conversion. When we look at it on a percentage basis, meaning what is the total area of Virginia and what is that loss of acres per that total area, we are at a agricultural land loss of about 4% statewide. And that puts us at number 11. These are very helpful reports, and after this webinar, I'll be happy to email links to everyone that can access these reports, but there are two separate reports that are for Virginia. One addresses the threat, the other one addresses the policies. And I think it's very helpful to separate the two because one is really market-driven and what is happening under the economic conditions. The other is, what are we doing from a legislation perspective, from a federal and state and local budgetary perspective as it relates to addressing what we are seeing happen from those economic conditions. Now, this is where we're going to get into the data. And I do apologize because we're going to go through quite a lot of data here. But it's important to understand, and I think for many of you who either live in Goochland or live in Hanover or elsewhere in our region, you're going to want to understand how your locality fares. Remember, in Virginia, we have seen from 2001 to 2016, a loss of 4% of our ag soils. I took this a bit further back to 1978. I was born in 1976. What has happened in my lifetime, and perhaps many of your lifetimes, in terms of the loss of our agricultural soils in the region? Henrico County, in that 40-year period, has lost nearly 67% of its agricultural land, according to the US Department of Agricultural Census. They are by far the most urban and suburban low-density developed converter in our region. When you look at the other communities, Powhatan is also a very high conversion rate of almost 32% of its agricultural land lost. Hanover has lost 27%, New Kent has lost 28%. Interestingly, Charles City County has seen an increase of 4% of its agricultural land. And that is predominantly because forest land has been converted to agricultural land. The US Census of Agriculture does not inventory for forest land. As an entire region, we have lost 25% of our agricultural land. And that far outpaces the entire state of Virginia that in this time frame had lost 17.6%. When we look at how many acres of ag lands are in each jurisdiction, this is that data put by trend as an absolute of the agricultural land. So as of today, we have slightly more than 250,000 acres of agricultural land in our region. And that is down from nearly 350,000 acres. One point that I would like to highlight when you look at Henrico County today has less than 10,000 acres of agricultural land in active production. Now, mind you, Capital Region Land Conservancy in 2018 purchased Malvern Hill Farm, 871 acres of a farm that we protected from being converted to a low density housing development. But of that property, only about 300 acres are active agricultural land. The rest are forested or actually not in agricultural production. Again, what is that percentage of the area of each locality that is assigned to agricultural uses? And this is active agricultural uses. And what we have seen is that in each of these localities, the percentage has gone down consistently year over year. From in Hanover back in 1978, more than 40% of its land area was in active agricultural use, to now just under 30%. And of course, it's no surprise why these loss of lands is happening is because we have seen a population growth. So as the population chart has grown, we have seen the loss and conversion of our agricultural lands. And you can see here the general trend. Richmond, the city, has basically been flat. It had a decline and then it's rebounded back to about the time, the same population that it had back in 1978. One very interesting statistic that I think we all need to be mindful of is by 2030, 90% of the United States population will be living in cities. So while we have this urbanizing effect in our culture and in our nation, it's not necessarily resulting in the stabilization of our agricultural land. Now to talk a little bit about policy. We know what has happened as it relates to the agricultural land loss by jurisdiction. Well, The Farms Under Threat report, as I mentioned, also addresses policies. They looked at 6 distinct policies as a way of comparing state by state, and then gave each one a score and did a weighted results here. Virginia is right at the top of the second quartile for states in terms of policy response. On the first line, where my cursor is, PACE stands for Purchase of Agricultural Conservation Easements, where that is a common term in other states. We do not have that term necessarily in Virginia, and I will get to what we do instead of PACE here. The second is land use planning, which is essentially, do we have comprehensive plans? Are we planning for the future of our land appropriately? Property tax relief for farms and agricultural properties. Agricultural districts, which are separate from tax relief. A program called FarmLink, and then state leasing. And in this, you will see that, frankly, New Jersey scored the highest in terms of its policy response. And I know John Jones is on this, and that probably does not surprise him from having seen what they have done in New Jersey. Of course, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Interestingly, the top 4 policy states are all Chesapeake Bay watershed states. That, to me, shows that the Chesapeake Bay program has placed an emphasis on doing a lot of land conservation, on providing programs to help their farmers, and that helps to go to improving water quality, since so much of our water quality impairment is due to runoff associated with livestock in our streams and our rivers, etc. Now, Virginia. I took the same 6 policies that were in the Farms Under Threat report, and I'm presenting to you today how they relate to the Virginia State Code as well as to each of our jurisdictions in the Richmond region. First, PACE, Purchase of Agricultural Conservation Easements. As I mentioned, we don't have that program in Virginia, but we do have the Farmland Preservation Program. And what it does is creates a Purchase of Development Rights program, and it is state funded. It is a program that requires a locality to put up a match and for that locality to have a PDR program. Well, it's somewhat unfortunate to say, but the state budget has less than $500,000 for the Purchase of Development Rights in its entire budget. And many localities try to leverage those dollars. And so, for an example, New Kent County has an annual budget of about $150,000 that they put into their Purchase of Development Rights, which if they have a conservation easement that they can buy, put 150 in, the state will match that for 150, a total of $300,000 could go to the landowner. But that's not a whole lot of money in a Purchase of Development Rights initiative when it comes from the state. Where the majority of the state's money is put today is in its Land Preservation Tax Credit Program, which Farms Under Threat report did not assess the role that the tax credit program has because it was not a high enough consistent policy across all 50 states. Even though Virginia has $75 million a year in its budget for tax credits for the Land Preservation Tax Credit Program, it is not recognized under this report, and it will be as they update the report going forward in the future. But that's an important discrepancy between looking at a Purchase of Development Rights program and what we put in for the tax credits. I will also reference here that Virginia has the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation that by statute, the governor is supposed to request $20 million a year. This year it's got 4.5 million, and it could have 10 million based on how the General Assembly comes out of their discussion during the special session for the budget. So this is an important difference where they issue grants and they have tax credit programs rather than funding PDRs. Land use planning, not a problem. Under Virginia code, every locality must have a comprehensive plan. So every county or the city has a comprehensive plan. Therefore, that criteria is met and we score the highest under that provision. And then when we talk about property tax relief, we in Virginia do have a land use taxation program, which is available for farms and forest and open spaces who are registered with the locality for that particular land use. And they have to re-enroll each and every year. But the issue is if you convert your land use, you then have to pay back what they call a rollback tax, which is up to 5 years of the previous tax liability that had been forgiven because of the land use tax relief. So in our region, currently, Chesterfield, Goochland, Hanover, Henrico, and Powhatan have land use taxation. I highlight the fact that Charles City and New Kent County do not. Agricultural districts are similar to a land use tax program in the sense that you receive the same tax benefit, but you enroll a geographic area through the cooperation of multiple landowners, and you do it for a number of years, often between 4 and 10 years. And that is an agreement not to convert those properties. And it is a collective agreement between those landowners and the locality. And those landowners receive essentially the land use tax relief. Hanover, New Kent, and Powhatan are the only 3 jurisdictions in our region that have agricultural districts where you can enroll your property. So when you look at this under property tax relief, you can see that Hanover is participating in both individual parcels applying for the land use tax program as well as agricultural districts. But New Kent is only allowing for agricultural districts and not individual parcels. And what is absent here is that Charles City County has neither. They do not give any tax relief to farms or forests or open space. One of the other criteria for policies in the Farms Under Threat report is FarmLink. And FarmLink is a really interesting program in the sense that they connect the landowner to a producer or a farming business. And sometimes it's a landowner who has been the producer, who has been farming, but is ready to exit the business, but doesn't want to see their land reused for a different purpose. Oftentimes these are retired farmers, and they will then put their property into FarmLink, let other farmers know that it is now available for lease, and it will connect those businesses with the landowners. And similarly, farmers who don't have any land to farm, who may need farming land, put in their needs, and a landowner may be there to respond to them. So it's really kind of your Match.com for farming, right? We're finding marriages of landowners and ag producers. So Virginia does have a program, and the link is provided here. And finally, the last policy, and this is a little bit difficult in Virginia, but we do not have the state going in to purchase agricultural properties to then turn around and lease them to agricultural producers. A lot of other states will go in and buy land to protect it and then turn around and lease it back to private producers. And Virginia does not do that. These are some basic information. So if ever you are interested in learning, does Appomattox County have forest and agricultural districts, or are there purchase of development right programs in Caroline County. There is a directory that is maintained, two separate directories, one by the Department of Forestry, and then the other one is with the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. What is nice about the one that you see at from the Department of Forestry is it will tell you which land trusts also serve those jurisdictions. So you look up at Hanover, it'll say Capital Region Land Conservancy. Now,
Parker, if you don't mind me pausing, John Jones put in the chat that he was exploring the FarmLink program in New Jersey for about 18 months ago. I'm wondering, John, if you have just a quick experience that you wanted to share or any insights from that. And if not, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Oh, no, you're fine. So New Jersey has a FarmLink program. They've actually had one for a number of years. And I can certainly provide the link to that. But I was actually talking about the state acquiring land with the expectation of then turning around and leasing it out to farmers. I was developing a GIS method for the state to try to examine which sites across the state would be best equipped for the state to acquire and then run a beginning farmer incubator site out of one of those state-owned farms. So if anybody is interested in talking about that more later, I can. I don't want to mess up with the Parker's flow here, but FYI, I guess.
Well, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
And John, I think you're getting into our next section very well, which is, well, what are we doing about all this, right? We know what our existing policies are. We know the threat that is there, and we know that we need to do more from a policy perspective. So state leasing may become a strong recommendation that we can make.
One more thing I'll say before I shut my mouth on this. My former boss at New Jersey Department of Ag, he's from Virginia and is very passionate about encouraging better policy making in Virginia. And I'd love to give him a reason if he ever had the bandwidth to talk with you all. He is very, very knowledgeable and has a lot of opinions about agriculture in Virginia, apparently. So I heard about him for a long time.
Well, great. Well, I'm going to go through just some maps very quickly so that you can see what this impact has been for our region. And this just shows land use cover. The red is the urban, highly dense development. The orange is that low density residential development that the report really is critical of. And so here, what you can see is what farmland that had been registered with the USDA was then converted, and that is shown in this map in red. And you can see quite a lot of land in our region, mostly on the peripheries, a lot in Chesterfield, a lot going up into Mechanicsville. We still, fortunately, have much of eastern Henrico with a lot of green, and that is our ag soils and ag lands, as well as going to the west into Powhatan and into Goochland, but you can see where up towards Oilville, there had been a lot of conversion. Again, this is a new model that the American Farmland Trust has released, talking about productivity, versatility, and resiliency, meaning these soils are a bit more unique in that they can do multiple types of crops, that they can rebound under climate conditions that might be adverse, etc. And you really begin to see a void around the city in those areas where things have been converted because of you're not going to be resilient if you're right up to the threat. And then, of course, another new model that the American Farmland Trust has released, which is their nationally significant agricultural land. This is different than prime farm soils that we usually report or farm soils of a statewide significance. This is a new nationally significant agricultural land model that they have. And all of this data is available on their website, and I will send the link. It's got a complete spatial map of the United States, and you can go in and click on layers. It's quite informative, and you can zoom right into your own neighborhood if you're interested. One thing I think is also interesting about what lands have been protected in the Richmond region per locality is who owns it. right? We said there is no state leasing program, but when you look at, for example, Chesterfield County, there's over 8,000 acres of state-owned land, and it's mostly the state park there. But they're not making them useful for production. Or state-owned land in New Kent County is 3,500 acres. So you see a disparity in what land has been protected, but who owns it and for what purposes. Now I'll talk about how are we going to address this going forward. We use a lot of models and a lot of science that we do in our conservation work. And one of the prime models that has come out in recent years through the governor's initiative and the Secretary of Natural Resources and Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry is called Conserve Virginia. Well, Conserve Virginia looks at ag soils. It also has models that are older models associated with prime and statewide significant ag soils. And so what I'm showing you is in our region, where are those properties that are protected and who owns them? So local lands versus federal lands versus a conservation easement on private property. That red shows private conservation easements on private land, such as ones that Capital Region Land Conservancy might hold. These are the agricultural soils of a class from 1 to 5. And again, you can see where they are populated around the city center. And now that Conserve Virginia model, which ranks the top 10% of agriculture and forestry combined for land protection. This is the top 10% in the entire state that needs to be protected. And it's informed by a 21 metric model. Well, I'm going to toggle backwards. These are our agricultural soils. These are our prime agriculture and forestry soils. And if you look closely, predominantly down here, close to the Appomattox River, where you see that orange, it's gone. They're not agricultural lands down there. This is predominantly forest land that they would like to protect. So that model is not great for our purposes of preserving farmland. We really need to be looking more specifically into the details. And here I've layered it all, and what I want to share with you all of the importance of this is you will begin to see a ring around the city of where these properties that have either been protected or should be protected with good ag soils or good forest timber. And that becomes an issue that we really need to contemplate as a region. There are such things as green belts. Well, that right now is our inherent green belt, which is just outside of 288 and of 295. So we should be, yes, John.
So sorry. We've got a question in the chat from Paul Louie asking if there's any distinction between plant and animals food production.
For ag soils or ag lands, when we get to the soils, we talk a lot about the prime soils, but for agricultural land, typically it is not distinctive between the two. But I will say that for animal production, you're seeing a lot more consolidation. You think about Tyson's and Purdue for chickens. We lost our last dairy operation in Goochland County last year. There's not a single dairy operation in the entire county. They used to have quite a bit. So there's a different consolidation that's going on there.
Parker, do you know what the criteria is for the national soils? I mean, are they looking at forestry and agriculture?
They are not looking at forestry whatsoever. So it really takes that component away. And they do report even, Jane, on forest land converted to agricultural land, right? As we've seen in some of our easements, well, you can have a forest in prime soils, and it doesn't necessarily change the condition of the soils that you could have agricultural production in the future. But I think to the point that Paul Louie was asking about, for crop production versus animal production, one of the things that we look at, and this is where you get to the parcel by parcel type of analysis, is the USDA web soil. And you can go in there and put in a shapefile. We're learning GIS. We're not experts at GIS, but we are learning. And I just give you this example of a property in Hanover where what is prime soil versus non-prime soil is highlighted on the left, green being prime soils, red being non-prime soils, and then you can see exactly the soil classification. And for those who are really interested in this stuff, you can get lost into these data layers. But in this example, you can see that they are farming the portion of the property that is non-prime farm soils, but it is soils of statewide significance. And so that is still a very highly productive portion of the property. Policy. Now, we do a lot with our land conservation, but on the policy side, we've got to do more. And I'm proud that Capital Region Land Conservancy helped to co-author a policy paper through the Virginia Conservation Network. This was just released, called Creating a More Resilient and Sustainable Food System. Essentially, during COVID-19, we saw that this aggregated food system where everything got consolidated and it got further away from the consumer created a huge supply chain disruption. And Kevin Engel, who's here today, said just yesterday that part of the problem was that we eat at restaurants. We're used to going and buying and eating prepared foods. And the moment that we had to shift to cooking at home, we inundated our stores who could not necessarily meet the demand in that supply chain network. So we have to reevaluate how we address this to be resilient. So some of the policy recommendations here, and this is just something that we will work for, is to fully fund the Virginia Office of Farmland Preservation. As I mentioned, they only have $300,000 for the PDR program. Continue to fund the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation, fund the tax credit program. Also evaluate and make a comprehensive list of those properties that have those nationally significant soils that are the top priority that we could get Farm Bill funding through their agricultural land easement programs. Expand APHID program. If you're familiar with APHID, it's a way of doing economic development, but supporting ag and forestry initiatives and the whole vertical integration of the business models. Fund local food to school programs where the school systems can buy locally instead of having to basically buy from national suppliers. And then some of these other programs get into more of the local Virginia's Finest and Virginia Grown, Virginia Food Access Investment Fund, and then the Virginia Fresh Match program that would allow for SNAP recipients, our lower income community members who, in order to access fresher food, need additional subsidies to do a one-to-one match for the farmers markets and resolve heirs properties. So that's some of the analysis that we've come up with for how Virginia could improve what we're doing on a policy side as well as a funding side. And then on this really large landscape, how can Capital Region Land Conservancy tackle the fact that we are seeing such aggressive loss of farms? And we are exploring a 5-year agreement with the United States Department of Agriculture called an Agricultural Landscape Easement Agreement. We're also exploring the creation of a regional conservation partnership program that would allow us to partner with soil and water conservation districts, with local Native American tribal nations. And so there's this effort to try to become more regional in that. Also something that Virginia has applied for, and this is a fascinating program called the Sentinel Landscape. And that is a program where the Department of Defense comes together with the United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Interior to combine their funds to do landscape scale conservation easements. And they have one in eastern North Carolina around Fort Bragg and some of the other forts along the eastern coast. And they have basically preserved wildlife habitat, farmland, etc. And they're doing, parachute training out there and doing nighttime surveillance training to keep the military ready, because they understand the threat that happens when development occurs and they are no longer able to come into Virginia. And then here locally, doing a bit more on the urban agriculture. So Richmond is one of 5 communities nationwide that has a city committee under the Farm Service Agency, and it has just been formed, and it will allow for a committee to make recommendations to the FSA on how Farm Bill policy and Farm Bill funding should be addressing the needs of urban agriculture community development. And that's something that is going to be a major part of our work going forward, because as I showed you all the map, we have this green belt, but we need to begin infilling it with more agricultural opportunities. And that's something that John Jones, who's on this, and I have talked about, along with a number of others. So just to share with you a couple of examples of farms, and then I will wrap my portion up so that we can talk a bit more. We protected Powhatan, Norwood Farm in Powhatan, 145 acres. Westerham Farm in Henrico County with 96 acres. Malvern Hill Farm in Henrico County and Charles City County. Recently, we've done some smaller farm properties, 72 acres in Henrico County. And our most recent conservation easement recorded earlier this month was 49 acres in Henrico County. So that is the end of our discussion and presentation. I would like if you would unmute yourself so that we can have a bit more of a dialogue, and I will stop sharing my screen so that we can talk a little bit more about what you have just seen, because there's a lot of data and it shows what has been going on for decades in the Richmond region and how our policy response hasn't met that threat, what we could be doing, and how do we get there as a local land trust with the community support. So with that, any initial thoughts from our participants? And if you unmute, I can call on you. Or I can cold call you. I see Rob just muted himself. Well, Kevin, you do a lot of farming. What are your thoughts? And we don't have any volume right now.
How about now? Better?
Yes.
I'm just really kind of taken away with everything that you're showing there that is being done, and really thankful to see it, because once land is developed, that's it. You can't get it back. And I'm really pleased to see all these different things. It's a lot more than what I realized, quite honestly, Parker. I think the conservation easements things are great. I think they've really helped with preserving a lot of good farmland around, and I look forward to that continuing to be funded and being even more useful in the future. I've done one myself for our own property, and we're in the middle of doing a second one. And then I also did 4 for an estate that I managed for a friend of mine, and it was very helpful. It allowed us to do some things financially to stabilize farms and preserve them, and just it's a great tool to use. And Eastern Henrico really troubles me, because there's a lot of good land out there, and I would love to see it preserved as much as possible. I worry about as land around is developed there in eastern Henrico, as well as other areas, that they keep in mind of what land is going to be saved, so that they can develop it in such a way so that the remaining farmland can be farmed.
Rather than the fragmentation.
Yes. I'll give you, for instance, Midview Farm in eastern Henrico is privately owned. And I started farming it in 1987, and the people that worked for the owners then told me that they felt like I had about 5 years before it was developed. And I'm still farming it, thankfully. And that goes a lot to say about the owners of it, I think, wanting to try to preserve it. But they also personally feel like they're pretty wealthy, and they're like, if you want to preserve something, preserve it yourself. Don't depend on other things to preserve it for you. But not all of us can be that independent. But we have to be very cautious with a lot of our agricultural practices to make sure that we're not going to have problems from the wall-to-wall houses all the way around it, or the people in the wall-to-wall houses. And that's a little bit challenging sometimes. Also, I thought it was interesting. This is just, I'm sure it's an anomaly, but the county that doesn't give any tax credits or any land use is the one that had the agricultural increase, Charles City. It's kind of odd, but I'm sure that's not the norm by any stretch. That wasn't the driving factor by any stretch, I'm sure, in that ag land being increased.
I can share from a study that we participated in 2 years ago now, that in Charles City County and in New Kent County, and probably in most counties, a conservation easement generates a surplus for the county. And that's largely because when you build all these homes, you got to provide services. You got to provide roads. You got to provide fire departments. You got to provide police. You got to provide schools. And these are the types of things that just bring up a budget from an expenditure side, but the value of the homes don't ever cover the cost.
Right.
Whereas you have working lands, even though they are protected by an easement and their value is diminished, you're still getting tax revenue from it, but you're not getting a huge explosion of expenses. Right. And they're generating taxable working jobs, etc.
Well, Parker, this is
Yes,
Tad.
Pat.
You just hit the nail on the head. My favorite expression that we used to talk about when we talked about that, and pointing to New York when they went bankrupt, cows don't go to school. So that's important.
They generally don't need police either, do they?
Right.
Or rescue squads.
They're big enough to look after themselves.
Yep.
Good point, Tad.
Yeah.
Well, Patty, I know you do a lot in Hanover. What are your thoughts?
Well, one thing we're involved in, I and 3 other folks whose names would be real familiar to Kevin, and that we are working since the last comprehensive plan in Hanover to try to make the rural portion of the comp plan have some more vigorous language about rural protection, because rural protection also equals agricultural economy. And Hanover likes to tout how much we have it, how many dollars we have in agricultural economy. But, if you don't have the farmland, you have the economy to go with it. So we met with our board of supervisors, each of them. They are philosophically on board with us. So our next comprehensive plan update comes in about 2 years, and we are working toward, we've looked at other counties and how they have set out in clear language how they are going to protect rural land. And we want to see that really change in Hanover, because we have, and Kevin, you know this, we have got real big development pressure here.
Yep.
And so we have to, you know, we have to protect those rural lands, open spaces, and all that great green space. So
Right.
we're working hard.
We're thankful for that in the agriculture community. We're very thankful for that.
So
Y'all
John,
do a great job.
John
Thank you.
Jones, I hope I don't put you on the spot, but what does this report tell you about the future of urban agriculture?
So I found it interesting that in one of your recommendations, was it the recommendations that you guys created, the policy, that long list of policy recommendation bullets? Midway through that list was exactly the geospatial research that I want to be doing to try to identify where are the ideal locations to put urban and suburban agriculture that is also mitigating stormwater and absorbing heat island effects. And so it's interesting to me that you guys basically already said, hey, we need to do this, and now I want to do that.
We want to help you do that.
Oh, great! Please. But there's maybe a lot of information to take in, but on a broader perspective, I think that. What am I trying to say here? Sorry, it's late in the day, and I've been sitting at the computer all day, as I'm sure probably the rest of you all have. I think there's an interesting moment, it seems like, for the region, that there's a recognition that you all are talking about now, that there are potentially policy tools that other regions are using to engage in interventions to try to protect against suburban sprawl as it pushes out away from Richmond proper. And I think it's really refreshing that you all are trying to talk about what those potential policy solutions are. And I would encourage you to be open to the idea that some of that might be quite outside of the box in comparison to what a lot of your local officials and board members are probably used to hearing. But if you want to, at least in my experiences in working in ag development in New Jersey, you have to, I think you kind of have to look outside the box a little bit, because what is traditionally working, or what has traditionally worked in the region, might not necessarily be working anymore. And I think the AFT report kind of underscores that. Was that at least on some level what you were looking for, Parker?
I'm just looking for everybody's thoughts.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to share?
I had a question in relation to what he was saying there. Did you find any data while you were looking through this on how this region of Virginia compares with the surrounding regions and what they're doing differently, maybe?
So our region, I did not go county by county to look at the other regions, but I will say that for the most part, our region is been experiencing some of the fastest growth on a percentage basis. So population-wise, from a job creation perspective, we've been growing much faster than Hampton Roads, which during the federal budget sequestration saw a contraction, as did Northern Virginia. So our region really saw an explosion, and what we're seeing at least is that our region isn't reliant on a single industry. So yes, we have government, but we've got manufacturing, we've got farming, we've got a diversity of the economy here, which is a good thing. So we are probably at a greater threat because of how well other things are occurring. But we shouldn't ever lose sight that Virginia's #1 industry is agriculture. The second industry is tourism, and the third industry is forestry. And why tourism is so popular in Virginia is because we have probably the most beautiful landscape of anywhere in the entire country, where you can go in one day from, sandy beaches to the mountains, and you have these wonderful rivers and estuaries in between. it's an incredible place, and people know about it. So, does that answer your question, Madison?
Yes, thank you.
Parker, I think I would chip in there that one, speaking of lost landscapes, I think the upper Piedmont region, surrounding DC and east of Route 15. I mean, it's even stretching out to Route 15 now, and Fairfax County and Loudoun. It's just very sad, the landscapes that are lost there, and the farmland. And of course, you look down to Tidewater, and Princess Anne County is gone. It's now Virginia Beach, those great huge cities that have, or Suffolk, same thing. But Virginia Beach, that Princess Anne used to be one of the largest strawberry growing areas on the East Coast.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Not that we're doing that great.
I've done plenty of strawberry picking in Pungo. Well, anybody else? Paul, you've unmuted. Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, so this is a simplistic question, but for the farmers, how do you determine what's the best cash crop to grow?
Well,
I might give that one to Kevin.
And I've got a question for Kevin after that.
I gotta go, fellas. So now I think that just depends a little bit on what your particular farm is set up to do. For instance, I'm a grain farmer. If this year it pays to grow cotton, I can't just change to cotton because I don't have all the cotton equipment or the knowledge base to do that. If it's best this year to grow peanuts, I can't change to that. So I have to stick within my abilities, and my abilities right now are field corns, white and yellow, white for flour milling and some yellow corns for flour milling, as well as feed, soybeans for meal, as well as oils, as well as export for tofu and natto, and then wheat for different uses. Some of the wheat is used for feed for poultry. Some of the wheat is used for different baking characteristics in flour mills. The flour mills will require certain varieties of wheat for you to identity preserve and then bring to them preserved so that they can mix them at the right blends to come out with the right flour for their market that they're addressing at the time. Milo is something that we grow for Smithfield for the hogs, but we also have a new market for that. That's an export market where we'll containerize it. One of the grain purchasing companies have struck a good deal with the Port of Richmond and built a facility in the Port of Richmond where they can take in grain and load containers and ship out. And that's created a lot of basis improvement for grain farmers in and around the Richmond area. And also maybe some new opportunities to ship out some types of grains that particular markets overseas need.
Well, Kevin, you were saying yesterday to me how COVID really changed in China.
Yes.
How they used to feed slop to their pigs and other, livestock that they would then eat. Well, COVID, they put new restrictions because they were concerned about sanitary conditions, the diseases that might be conveyed through animals, and then started to require more grain feed for livestock than had been practiced before in China. So we're seeing some changes just as a result of current conditions.
It's not really possible to get a clear answer from China on what that number is, but some people have done a little bit of analytical work and think it could be as high as 30% of their ration was basically coming from spoiled food. Mm-hmm. So if they're going to replace that now with soybean meal and corn, that creates some additional demand for soybeans and corn, and that's certainly has kicked in the marketplace, along with some of the trade agreements that have been developed, has kicked in the marketplace, and really it's grain prices are not certainly they're certainly not at an all-time high by any stretch, but they're a lot better off than they were 6 months to a year ago. And it's about the first time I've seen in my lifetime where nationally in this country, it's one of the better crops we've ever had. Some of the highest average yields of corn and soybeans nationally that we've ever grown. And the market prices actually are going up during harvest. That's a very uncommon thing. And our farm is set up to store our grain. We have about 2 million bushels of grain storage, and we try to get an improved basis over time by storing it post-harvest and delivering it. And this year, the market is saying, we want the grain now. We want to ship it out now. They're not paying us a carry in the market to store it. Unfortunately, just like the restaurant and the grocery store scenario, I'm set up to store my grain and hold my grain with my trucks and everything. There's no way I can deliver all that grain to the export terminals during harvest and get the harvest done timely. I'd lose the crop trying to do that. So, and nor could the export terminals handle all that grain from all the farmers during this short period of time. So, every action has 2 or 3 reactions, and that's part of it. So I have to stay with, getting back to your original question, I have to stay within my limits of what I can do, and just look at the annual markets, look at my rotations, look at the productivity of the lands that I have available for that year, and decide what I think is the best for our operation, not knowing what the potential weather is going to be.
Well, I've got a question, Kevin, about soybeans. Maybe it's a stupid one, and I did a little bit of row cropping on a very small scale, but every time I see my daughters order a bowl of edamame, I mean, isn't that basically a raw soybean that's still green? And the prices they get, $5 for a bowl, what would be involved to pick soybeans green for the edamame market?
I have a hard time saying that word, but right. I know what you're talking about, and my son Casey has checked into it quite a bit. It is a different soybean than the soybean we grow. There's different acid contents, different nutrition amounts in the same grain family. For instance, canola versus rapeseed. We used to grow canola for the human food market, but there wasn't a marketplace in place well enough that you could consistently get paid for it. You ended up getting stuck a lot of times. We switched to rapeseed, where now Purdue is using that in their chicken feed, and they're extracting the oil, selling the oil, and using the meal to feed their chickens. If you feed a chicken canola, you'll kill him, because it's a totally different acid content. But growing, it looks the same. The seed looks the same. The plants require the same agronomy, the same harvest times, all of that. But if you don't keep them separate, you can't do it. Our contracts to grow rapeseed for Purdue, one of the things we have to sign off on is that we have not grown any canola on that land in 5 years, so that there can't be any volunteer come through and mess up the purity of it. So edamame is a different thing than a regular soybean, as well as there's different soybeans within the soybean family. There's some research being done quite a bit in Petersburg and by the what is the college down there? State what?
Virginia State University.
State, yeah, on that. And one of the things that I think they have found so far is that our growing conditions here in Virginia just don't quite fit for that crop. Now, can the crop be modified to grow here in Virginia somehow through some research and development? I think it can, but that takes time and money.
Well, are there any other questions or comments before we wrap up for tonight?
I did have one, and maybe I missed it earlier, but how is PDR funded here in the state of Virginia? I actually don't think I've unpacked that.
So PDR is funded with state matching money through the Office of Farmland Preservation, which has a statewide budget of about $300,000.
Which is not a lot of money.
And then they require a 1-to-1 match from the locality.
Okay.
That's where the money comes from.
That's not that much money.
It's not much money.
Not that much money.
No. I would like to just go back briefly. I'm going to share my screen to get you back to the just what's next. So for Team Fields, we have a couple of additional activities. There's the All Teams Volunteer program scheduled for this Saturday. We also have the closing ceremonies on the 25th. And today, thanks to Tad Thompson, we may have another volunteer opportunity on Sunday, which would be at 4 p.m. We haven't put this out there, but for anybody interested, it would be Sunday the 18th at 4 p.m. out at Tuckahoe in Goochland County, where we would help paint fences on the property. My video from the opening ceremonies talked about being a child and doing a lot of whitewash fence painting. So it'll bring back some memories. And Tad has agreed that my 3.5-year-old can come and paintbrush. So it should be a lot of fun.
We'll provide rollers, and I'll send you a picture of where we'd like to have folks paint. It's really easy. Park your car and walk 10 feet to where you can paint. Just don't paint your car.
And then just as a reminder, we have our Team Fields giving page, www.justgiving.com/campaign/Team Fields. And if you haven't signed up for any team yet, please go and sign up. We would welcome you at this stage to sign up for Team Fields or Team Forest or Team Streams, and to invite your friends and colleagues to join you in the 2020 Conservation Games, to invite them not to just Team Fields programs, but also to the next webinar, which is going to be Thursday night at 7, hosted by Team Streams with folks from the Department of Environmental Quality who will be leading that program. And again, thank you, Kevin, for not only answering all of the many questions and demonstrating a wealth of knowledge about farming, but for your very generous sponsorship of Team Fields and the Capital Region Land Conservancy's 2020 Conservation Games, and to our other sponsors that we have for the duration of the games. And we are wrapped for tonight.
Parker, if I may just remind everyone to submit their points for attending this webinar, and to submit their points for any other activities that they have participated in. I will post the links right now in the chat to submit your points and join the team if you have not already done so. And just, if there's any confusion about the submit your points process, you submit it every time you do something. So if you've already attended a learning event, or if you've already attended a volunteer event, you should submit it for each time you do it, or just click the multiple options when you submit it. And feel free to ask me some questions if you find it confusing. So click that form before this meeting ends so that it shows up on your browser and you can submit it right away. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank
Go
you.
Team Fields.
All right. Good night.
Everybody.